I had thought of this idea of an anthology for many years, but I had dismissed the idea because I thought that most of the pieces were too time-bound. However, when I had some time lately, after I sold my newspaper and was able to delve into some of the old files, I found that a substantial number were relatively timeless and not dated by the specific events that were discussed in those pieces. And I decided at that point that there was the potential for a book here. It took a bit of work pulling it together. I had a computer file I constructed of about 2,000 articles and had a box of clippings of about another 1,000 articles, some of which I scanned in. Of those 3,000 articles, about 100 were picked for the first draft of this book, which I think were then reduced down to 70 or 80. So there was a lot of selectivity involved, and it was took far longer, far more months than I thought it was going to take. In putting together this book, the thought occurred to me of another book I might do afterwards, a more personal book. And the title that I came up with in my own mind was, the working title was Coming to Terms. And if there's anything that I have concluded about life, I think that phrase captures it. That you need to know who you are and what you represent and why you are. You need to come to terms with what you are. People have mostly either grandiose ideas of themselves or they diminish themselves unfairly. To have the right sense of balance in the world, to come to terms with what you are and the way you do it, and to be able to face the reality, both pleasant and unpleasant, of that condition is of the essence of things, I think, and what I want to get at. Well, first off, I still do some reporting. I write a weekly newspaper column, and I do interviews, I check out documents, I call people, I go to meetings, I get involved with all kinds of things which are essentially reporting. For example, I have just this morning, was working on a piece on the World Laughter Day, which was celebrated yesterday. And I attended a meeting of World Laughter Day of people laughing themselves to death, and interviewed the guy out in California who started this thing in the United States, and a couple of other people in Santa Fe. So the skills of a reporter, the artistry of reporting, is important in many other kinds of writing. Even though a column takes a position and has opinions that news stories do not, columns often rely on the same techniques of gathering information. And of course, books and magazine articles do too. And I will be using some of those techniques. I'm working on a novel now also, dealing with the danger of a nuclear explosion at the plutonium laboratory in Los Alamos, an explosion triggered by an earthquake similar to what recently happened in Japan, except without the tsunami. This will involve a good bit of reporting. I will have to spend a lot of time in Los Alamos, and I'll have to spend a good bit of time trying to understand what happens when plutonium is spread around the landscape, to the earth, to the water, to the land, to people's breathing, which they inhale this plutonium. It's the most dangerous. So that the skills of reporting are applicable to the kinds of writing that I'm still doing, and I think are enduring. I think that they are necessary for much that we do in this world. Reporting is very different today. I think it's important to distinguish two things that often get confused. And one is reporting and the other is newspapers. Newspapers, so far as I can see, are dead. Community newspapers have another generation of life left in them because they don't have to compete directly with the web. But other newspapers, metropolitan newspapers, national newspapers, just don't seem to have much of a place left in the world for them anymore. But reporting does, and I think that, as I was saying a few minutes ago, uh, reporting is a skill that is part of life, part of society. I don't think society can survive without people going out there, gathering information, observing, and then interpreting and describing for others what they observe. And that is what reporting is. Without that, how do people get information? To have reliable information is certainly necessary for a democracy. I think it's necessary for any society, even a very primitive one. Although a primitive society may get this information face to face rather than through electronic media, it is still necessary to have this process of communication and have the communication be containing information and have that information be reliable and in a reasonable amount of time delivered to the audience. This is always going to happen. We're going to need reporters. Now, where these reporters are going to work, how they're going to get paid, how they're going to support themselves, these are the great questions that we in journalism have not been able to find answers to. In theory, websites would provide the alternative to print newspapers. So far, websites have not been able to generate enough income to hire large staffs of editors and reporters who can go out and do this kind of job. In the future, maybe they will be able to. I don't know. There are a lot of experiments going on. There are organizations like Political.com, which I use all the time and does have a staff of reporters, but it's very narrow gauge. It doesn't do anywhere near what a newspaper would do. I don't know what the future holds, but I do think that some kind of reporting is going to be very much a part of the future of this society, of all societies, and it's crucial. It's not going to be the kind of easy, consistent, reliable lifestyle that reporters a generation ago were used to, and that's why I would hesitate to recommend to a young man or woman that they go into reporting. Well, what's disappearing with the disappearance of what's been called the mainstream media is the filter. They have traditionally served as a filter between the raw sources of information, the interviews, the speeches, the documents, and the audience that consumes this information, so that the audience knows what to make of this information and can separate out the valid from the invalid, the true from the false, the real from the make-believe. And we're losing that filter. If we can reestablish credible websites that can serve as that filter, then this would be another way of performing the same function. If we don't have that, then the audience, the consumer of news, is taking on himself or herself a much larger burden. What it means is that, for example, if you are reading a blog or looking at a website that mentions a treaty, for example, you have to go and look at the treaty yourself to see if it's being quoted accurately. If somebody mentions an economic statistic, you're going to have to go to the department that generated that statistic or the polling organization that generated it to see if it's accurate. And this is something that very, very few people have either the time or the inclination or the ability to do. So there's going to be an awful lot of misinformed people in the world unless we can find new filters to help them. Naturally falls into several sections because my life naturally fell into several sections. One section deals with my life on the East Coast when I was working primarily for the Baltimore Sun, also a little bit for the New York Times, Newsweek magazine, Rolling Stone magazine, the New Leader magazine, and some other publications. This was the period of my life basically from the time I got out of the Army in 1965 until I came to New Mexico in 1978. These pieces deal with, for example, the interviews with the Vice President of the United States, many pieces about the Supreme Court, travels around the country doing political reporting, for example, the first black man who ran for governor of Mississippi, the hippie movement in the West that stirred so much controversy and conflict in the Rocky Mountains. The number of other stories like this that were written for an East Coast audience and East Coast publications. The second stage came after I moved to New Mexico, where I worked on pieces that deal more with sections of life, of human interest, less with politics, less with policy, less with movements, and much more with individuals and with the relationship of individuals to their environment, to their ecology. The final phase occurred when I moved to the East Mountain area where I now live and started a newspaper. And a lot of those pieces deal with the daily life of a newspaper editor and the life of a person living in the fairly wild mountains of New Mexico. Within these broad brackets, some pieces are extremely personal. There's a long section dealing with my adoption of my son in Russia and my impressions of Russia and the difficulties we had adopting him, and then pride when he finally became a citizen. Other long sections deal with our travels in Mexico. After we moved to the area where we live now, we spent a lot of time traveling in Mexico, and a country that fascinates me and where I constantly got into trouble down there. It seemed like I was always stumbling into some place I shouldn't be, doing something I shouldn't be doing. And so it made for interesting travels, and I hope interesting reading. A lot of other travels too led to pieces that I published in the newspaper and that I republished in this book. So those are the primary categories. Political pieces, feature pieces, pieces dealing with my personal life, for example, the adoption of my son, and travel articles. We have the good and the bad in all of us, the selfish and the altruistic, the dignified and the ignoble. And these tendencies are in conflict with each other. I believe that, and with some difficulty, I've struggled with this, but I do believe that the angels of our better nature will, all else being equal, come to the fore. Not always, certainly not inevitably, but that we can do the right thing sometimes. And maybe that is all we can ask of human nature.